Welcome to the Automotive Tech Talk podcast. This is number 2. I'm John Gardner. I'm your host. I'm actually hosting 2 television shows, Motorhead Garage and Tech Garage on Motor Trend TV, Mav TV, and Revin TV. Now we're delving into the podcast. So we're going to talk a little bit about air conditioning today. I'm an ASE Master Certified Tech, and I also work at Chipola College at the automotive program for over 20 years. I'm here with my sidekick, Josh Ellis. He is ASE Master Certified as well, and an instructor at the automotive program. Josh, it's getting hot out there, my friend.
It is. Nobody wants to drive around in a hot vehicle. So some things we're going to go over today is going to help you see how your air conditioner works and also some possible components that could fail.
Yeah, and you know what? You guys are important to us. So we field a bunch of questions that come in all the time. So we're going to jump right to it. A little ahead of our time with the questions. We'll look at some of them, and then we'll go back and we'll discuss why this is actually happening. So this is one of the questions here we got, Josh, and you guys can write into John G at johngardnertv.com. You can put it down in the comments. Just send your questions in. We'll put them on the podcast. These actually have to do with air conditioning. The first one is, my AC is not blowing very cold. Something under the hood is constantly clicking. I got an idea. What do you think?
Well, something constantly going click, 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 click. If that's the kind of noise you're hearing when you turn your air conditioning on, it's a good sign that your refrigeration system, your air conditioning system is low on refrigerant. And that's your compressor actually kicking on and off.
Yeah.
It's trying to save itself, because once that pressure gets low, you don't want to burn up your compressor.
Yeah, low on refrigerant. I called it Freon once. I got in trouble because Freon's an old brand name. Someone said, "Man, you must be 100 years old, Freon." I says, "Well, you want a tissue or a Kleenex?"
Well, that's a good one.
Same difference, right? All right, anyway. So yeah, just check your refrigerant levels, probably low. You got a cutoff switch, clicking it on and off. Another one of our viewers or listeners, they actually wrote in, they said, "When I'm sitting in the drive-thru or at a red light, my AC stops blowing cold air, but when I get up to speed, it's cold again." What's going on, Mr. Ellis?
Well, when you're sitting there at a red light and the thing stops blowing cold, what happens is when you're driving down the road, a lot of that air is being blown across a thing called a condenser that's actually on the very front of your vehicle. It's a condenser. And the heat that's being transferred from the inside of the vehicle that's blowing cold is being transferred to the outside. So something's going on, the fan's not working, the condenser fan's not working, that's not allowing that heat to transfer to the outside air. So when you're not moving, your fan is off, it's blocked or something, so the heat's not be able to transfer across that condenser. And then when you get to driving again, it's actually forcing that air across your condenser, and the heat transfer is able to take place.
So check the coolant fan. You know, people come in all the time with their air conditioning not working, but they don't look at the temperature gauge. Bam, it's pegged over there at 240, 250. The engine's blowing, it's hot, but hey, I don't feel any air, man. This is a problem. The heck with the engine. It's not going to cool, you know, so that's important too. Last one of my favorite ones, one of our viewers here or one of our listeners, they were on vacation. I love family vacation. Family's my favorite thing in the world. On the way back from family vacation, the airflow from our vents gradually decreased to the point where nothing's coming out. Uh-oh, no airflow.
I can actually relate to this. The same exact thing happened to us and our family on the way back from North Carolina. We were on the way back probably about halfway, and we got 4 kids in the car. Everybody's getting hot and sweaty. I'm hot, and my goodness, and the vents aren't blowing. Something's going on. In my case, it was a thermal expansion valve that was stuck open. That thing, what that does is that meters the amount of refrigerant going through the evaporator. We'll talk about evaporator shortly, but that meters the refrigerant going through the evaporator. And what happens, I don't know if you've noticed, underneath your car, you see this constant little drip, drip, drip. Condensation's occurring on that evaporator. So if it's not dripping down, then you can have an overflow there. But also what happens was the evaporator gets about 32 degrees, and it was just allowing too much refrigerant to go through, and it was freezing up, blocking the airflow going across the evaporator, and it wasn't blowing cold air in our vehicle.
Yep, that or just a blower motor problem not putting the air. There's air distribution doors in there. You know, it could be even just a simple vacuum. Sometimes when we lose engine vacuum, it goes up to the defrost mode because that's safe. We want to defrost our windshield. So look at something vacuum actuated. Look at the blowers. Like Josh said, something to do with could we be low on Freon freezing up that condenser? But Josh, we threw out a lot of big words, man. First of all, keep these questions coming. We want to answer these questions. We want to be a show for the people, and you guys are the people. So let's get into the system now that they understand a little bit. We threw out these words like compressor, condenser, evaporator. Let's just start for our listeners. Some of these guys can't see this. Let's start right at the compressor, Josh. What does the compressor do? That's the heart of the system, air-conditioned compressor.
That's right. Like you said, it's the heart of the system. And just like in your body, with your heart, it moves blood through your entire body, the thing in the vehicle that does this is the compressor, and it moves refrigerant through the entire system. So it's what makes all the heat transfer from the inside of the vehicle to the outside. You have all types of compressors. There's scroll type, radial type. They have variable displacement compressors where there's a wobble plate in there. And I know that's a little bit overboard, but just to give you a little bit of background, this is what controls the flow of the refrigerant through the entire system.
No, absolutely. You said refrigerant, the flow of refrigerant. So what can we do? What can we do just as a layman? Go out there in the yard or pop the hood. You heard that compressor cycling. We can do this thing. You did a tech tip on it really well called a touch test. You can kind of touch some of these lines and get a general idea. We'll talk about gauge readings in a minute, but coming into your compressor, you should have two lines. I mean, one is a high pressure and one's a low pressure. That's what divides the system. If I was to reach down and touch those lines, what would I feel?
That's right. Going into the compressor is the low side line. This is actually what's coming out of your vehicle. So you have that cold air blowing in your face, but it's because the evaporator is cold, and so the refrigerant is cold coming out of that and going into your compressor. So the one going in is going to be cold. Now you have to be careful when you're doing this touch test because excuse me, because one of the lines is going to be hot. As a compressor operates, it's compressing that. It's compressing the gas refrigerant. You don't want liquid refrigerant going in. It's compressing gas refrigerant. And when pressure increases, so does temperature. So one line going in is going to be cold. The line coming out should be hot. And so if it's not, you could have an issue with the compressor or be low on refrigerant. It's just cutting off and it's not compressing at all.
Well, there you go. Just go out there. Be careful. One's going to be cold. One's going to be extremely hot. But if you touch them, there should be a difference between the two lines coming out of your compressor. Now, you said that's what it does. It compresses it. It makes it hot. It heats that refrigerant. It does it for a reason, because what we're going to do after that is we're going to send it from the compressor. The first thing we want to talk about, and you mentioned it earlier, is the condenser. Now, that's located in the front of your car. You got a radiator and you got a condenser right there in the front of your car. So if you look down in between the radiator, usually in the front says condenser, and that's what the fan's blowing over. It's condensing. Condensing's turning that actual gas into a liquid. So what should my lines feel like? You got one coming into the condenser and you got one coming out of the condenser.
Absolutely. The line should still be hot going into the condenser. Again, this is coming out of the compressor. It's going from the compressor to the condenser. So that hot, high pressure gas is still going to be hot on that line going in. Now coming out, you do have some sort of heat transfer taking place. That's how that condensation happens inside, where it goes from a gas down to a liquid. So you're still going to have a hot line coming out. It won't be as hot because you have a little bit of heat transfer, but two lines coming out of there should be hot still.
So one's going to be hot, one's going to be a little less hot. It's all that about that law of thermodynamics. Heat transfers from a surface that's hot to less heat. So we're going to take some hot refrigerant, throw it in there. The coolant fan at 80 degrees is going to blow across it, and we're throwing the heat out to the outside air. Wow, that's how a car works. We actually grab the heat inside the car and throw it out so you feel cold. You're not really cold. There's no such thing as cold.
Absence of heat, that's right.
Yeah, you got that right. All right, so here's the deal. So I'm taking a shower. Oh, we're getting on the wrong subject here. But anyway, it's all steamed up. What happens when the bathroom starts cooling down?
It just condenses on that mirror.
Man, same thing's happening in the condenser. So you could check that out. Run your hand down at any restriction or any blocks. You'll feel a difference in temperature, but please be careful. Once again, these things are hot. So let's come out of the condenser, Josh. So we come out of the condenser, those two lines, and then we're going through this, what's called an orifice tube. We said our compressor changed the pressures from a high to a low. We change pressures in two places, and we change states of the refrigerant in two places. So we come out of the condenser with the, we come out of the condenser still a high pressure, right?
Right.
But we went from a gas to a liquid.
That's right. That's right. Like you said, we went from a low pressure gas to a high pressure gas in the compressor, and now we're coming out of the condenser and we're headed over to what's called an orifice tube.
Okay.
We're going to go from a a high pressure liquid to a low pressure liquid. And one of the crazy things, one of these things I don't understand about physics, is that pressure and temperature have a direct correlation. So if I want to drop temperature of a liquid, I have to drop its pressure. And so that's what they did. These engineers do some crazy stuff, and that's what they did with the orifice tube. They had a high pressure liquid going in and a low pressure liquid coming out. And all they did was put a restriction in there. So you should be able to do a field test with this as well. You can be able to find your orifice tube. On one side of that liquid line, it'll be hot. Again, be careful when you fill this. And on the other side, it will be cold. If all these other tests have come out right with doing your touch field test on the condenser and your compressor, and then you come over to this orifice tube and you have it's hot on both sides, something might be stuck open. Or
that's perfect. And that's actually the most extreme coldest place of it right there. So as weird as that sounds, we need to get I think Mr. Bodart, one of our physics instructors over here, he can probably show us better. We're just automotive guys. But hey, one side is hot, the other side is ice cold. That joker's doing its job.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. So we did get it really, really cold. So we got some cold, low pressure liquid now. Low pressure liquid, cold, going into the evaporator. Now the evaporator, that's located usually under your dash or inside your car. You see that big box on your firewall or bulkhead of the car. The old cars had it out there. The new one's usually located up under the dash of the car. This is where we're actually getting that heat transfer onto it, jumping onto it, running to the front of the car, boom, throwing it outside, and you're feeling colder. So your evaporator's located inside the car. If you can get to those lines outside the actual firewall of the car, I'm feeling them too. There should be a difference between those two lines because I'm going in cold and coming out a little less cold if we have that heat transfer happen. Tell us about the evaporator.
Well, the evaporator, this is where all the cooling in your vehicle takes place. As he said, as Mr. Gardner said, when it comes in, the evaporator is cold, and the heat transfer, when it's taking the heat from your cabin, placing it on the evaporator takes it and places it on the refrigerant, and it takes it right on the refrigerant and gets put on the front of the condenser. And as I was saying earlier, if that thing's blocked, that's not going to be able to jump on to the outside air. And that's where you want to go. That's the whole thing of this refrigeration cycle. It's basically taking the heat from the inside of the vehicle and putting it outside. It's just an AC cycle. That's what we call it.
Unless it's negative 432 degrees below zero, then it's cold.
Then it's very, somewhere Kelvins. I don't know.
That's real cold. That's cold. Other than that, there really is no cold. So, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. So, once again, touch those two lines. One's ice cold, the other not so cold, but still cool. It's doing its job. So, we're kind of just going down your AC system. You can go do this right in the driveway, man. That's the cool part. Now, is it exact science? No. Cool part. Yeah, right?
I got it.
Yeah, I like the Mr. Gardner part better. Yeah, that's even better. John G. Mr. Gardner. Now, all of a sudden, I know my stuff. Here we go. So, let's come down here. We go from there, we come out. So, we're still coming out. But, something happened in the evaporator. When it actually grabbed the heat, it changed states.
That's right.
So, our refrigerant went from a low pressure
liquid, and then we went to a low pressure gas. Went to a low pressure gas. That's right. So after we come out of the evaporator, then we go to another component called an accumulator dryer. Now, what the accumulator does is if there's any kind of refrigerant left over, the goal of the evaporator is to completely boil off that refrigerant. You go from a liquid to a gas. And as I stated earlier, you do not want any liquid getting into that compressor. It can cause all kind of malfunctions. So what the accumulator dryer does is it takes that refrigerant, it kind of hangs out in any that didn't get boiled off in the evaporator, it hangs out inside the accumulator at the bottom. And now this accumulator is inside the engine compartment, so is an engine compartment cold? No, it's pretty hot in there, right? So what it's going to do is it's going to do some more heat transfer, and that's going to allow the rest of that refrigerant to boil off before it gets to the compressor. But also something else that it does, excuse me, is it serves as a desiccant. One of the big enemies of a AC system is moisture getting into the refrigerant, and that has a desiccant inside of it. The accumulator has a desiccant inside of it that helps dry that refrigerant out.
Okay, so we're going to dry the refrigerant, but going in and out, the line should be similar. I mean, it's not really changing any pressures. It's not changing any states. All we're doing is get rid of that little bit of liquid that may have passed because you have an orifice tube system. We'll look at a TXV next, but it goes back to the compressor and it all starts all over again.
That's right.
Cool part, man, I'm getting good at this.
That's good.
This is the same thing in your house. I mean, this is your air conditioning, and your evaporator's usually inside. Outside is the big condenser unit. I mean, it's doing the same thing with the refrigerant. Yes, it's a different refrigerant. Yes, it's different pressures, but it's the same concept. So you can diagnose it the same way. Now, some cars have this next thing. We talk about a TXV, thermostatic expansion valve. You mentioned that earlier, big word. Nothing more than changing the states of the refrigerant, changing the pressures of the refrigerant, right? Just a little bit in a different place. So once again, we start at the compressor. We don't need to go over it again, but our compressor send it over to the condenser, and then our condenser did its job. So the line test should be exactly the same. You come down to what's called a receiver dryer. Now, we had that accumulator going into the compressor before. Now we have this accumulator right after the receiver dryer. Why is that?
Well, the receiver dryer does the opposite in some ways as the accumulator. It makes sure that the system has refrigerant available in liquid form, and it also filters out some of that moisture in the same manner as the other one does. It has a desiccant, in it as well.
Okay, so that's going to clean it, and then we're going to go to this TXV, thermostatic expansion valve. Expansion is E. I don't get it, but it's thermostatic expansion
You say
valve.
expansion, so you might as well go with
Expansion.
X.
There you go. So that's going to do the same thing as the orifice, but it's more precise, Josh. I mean, this is probably a better system. This is the orifice is a fixed regulation. This guy here, he's actually goes up and down, and he's got a sensing bulb on the out of the evaporator, so he knows what's going on, and he can allow that perfect amount of refrigerant to go into the evaporator to get that perfect cooling.
That's right. As I stated earlier, this was my problem on my vehicle. That TXV valve was stuck open, and as you said, what it does is it regulates. If you have a high demand for air conditioning, if you have a lot of heat in the vehicle, that thing's going to be wide open so it can allow all the refrigerant to go through. And as it senses that your refrigerant, as it senses your cabin is cooling off, you're not going to need so much of a refrigerant going through for your heat demand, so it gradually closes. And that just gives you a much more efficient way to cool your vehicle.
So it's sensing. It's got a sensing ball versus the orifice tube usually attached. If you look up under your dash, it may be somewhere there or going into the evaporator somewhere, but you have a little sensing ball sometimes on them that actually senses the line. A lot of times, some pattern failures, that thing pops off and it thinks it's a lot hotter in there than it is. We call it start flooding the evaporator, starts to get real flooded. It starts to freeze up. You talked about that as well.
Airflow,
Yep. And those restrictions are a problem. So just go around. You can pop the hood. You can do this field test that's running. You should feel those lines and you should know what's going on. Coming into the compressor, cold, going out, super hot. Going into the condenser, super hot, coming out, less heat. Going into the orifice or the TXV, hot, coming out, ice cold. Going into the evaporator, right? We have cold, ice cold, the coldest part of the system,
Right.
coming out cool. Then we return back to the compressor and start this thing all over again. Obviously, if that's happening, you should have cold air. If you don't, you have a problem.
Right, and if you do these tests and you have cold air, a cold line going into your evaporator and a cold line coming out, and you still don't have, it's still not blowing right, you still have a temperature where it's like, man, this is not blowing very cold, but your lines are cold, something's going on internally. Your system's probably seems to be operating how it should be if you do your field test correctly.
Exactly. Now, there's a lot of components, it's a lot of big words, but we get into this. You can also go out and get an inexpensive gauge reading set, and gauge readings are pretty cool. We can explain them. Our listeners can understand what's going on just with some high, low kind of readings of what's going on with the gauges. But you get a gauge set, you go out there, you screw it into what's called a quick disconnect on there. You can't even mess them up. The low line is a little bit fatter than the high side line. It's a little bit bigger. So you put the connector on there and you got these gauges sitting in front of you. Well, what are you looking at with the gauges? Well, one's going to be reading that low pressure side, and that low pressure side, we go from that orifice tube or that TXV back to the compressor. That's going to be low pressure. Well, what do I mean low pressure? That thing could range anywhere from 25 to 40, 45, usually dependent upon ambient temperature, what's going on outside.
Temperature and humidity makes a huge difference on your gauge readings.
Okay, so average, let's talk about they got YF 1234, they got all these fancy refrigerants, but everybody's probably got 134 in their cars, so somewhere around 32, 33, 35, around there on the low side. That's the side that's actually pulling it, sucking in from the low side in. So I'm pulling it down. So the low side from the orifice or the TXV back to the compressor should be anywhere from 30 to 35. Then you find that high side. The high side, we said, started at the compressor and ran to the orifice or TXV. That's what's making the pressure. So if I connect a line there, we should see anywhere from about 200 to 250, maybe a little bit higher there, here and there, depending on ambient temperature and it running. But if you have those pressures, 30 to 40, just round it up, 200 to 300 in that range, it should be blowing cold. I mean, it's going to blow cold. It's just physics. It's how it works. But we also run into a couple of problems with gauges, and we put them on there. And let's talk about the first one. The first one would be the low side is high. The low side is high, and the high side is high. So if the low side is high and the high side is high, how could they both be high?
First thing that goes in my mind is, well, as temperature increases, pressure increases. So if there's heat transfer is not taking place to the outside air, let's say you have a blocked condenser fan, that's exactly what's going to show up on those on the high side and low side of the gauges. It's not able to transfer heat.
Okay, so it's not transferring heat on that condenser on the front of the car. Your engine's hot. Pressures are rising. I mean, the low side is not pulling, so the pressure's going up, and the high side's pushing too much and the pressure's going up. So absolutely just pressure and temperature relationship. Also, it could be overcharged. Someone just
Right.
keeps putting refrigerant in. I know.
Stop blowing cold. Add more refrigerant.
I know a guy that does that. I'm not talking about me. Yes, I am. I just, old school, we just keep putting refrigerant in it. Now it's cold. Really bad. Today they need the precise numbers. That's critical too. So high and high. Let's talk about another one. What about low and low? So the low side is suctioned down all the way to about 20 psi, and the high side can only put up about 70 or 80 psi. So what's happening there? Low and low on both gauges.
Well, the most common thing would be that you have a low refrigerant charge. If it's low on refrigerant, you're not be able to pull the pressure, and you're not going to be able to compress a pressure either. So you're not going to be able to raise pressure on the high side, and you're not going to have any pressure on the low side.
Ooh, that was that click and compressor question number one, right?
Right, there you go. Yep, low on refrigerant. It's just going to cycle on and off. It tries to pull it down. It gets super low, and to protect the compressor, it cuts off. So then once that happens, it cuts off. Pressure steadily raises because of the temperature, and the compressor comes back on again, and it's like sucks it back down. It's like, oh man, I don't have anything. Turns it back off. So it's just a constant click, 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 click. Right.
A little bit tricky though. If you hook up gauges, these gauge sets, and let's say, for example, the compressor's not running or it's doing that cycling, it's on the off position, the clutch isn't engaged in the front. What are the gauges? What should they read without it running? Period. Should be about static.
Oh,
right?
static. Oh, sorry. Yeah. If you hook up your gauges before you even turn on the vehicle, one thing you can do to check your refrigerant charge is if it's roughly, let's just say it's 70 degrees outside, your pressures, your static pressures, that means when you hook up the gauges, you hook up the red ones to the high side and the blue one to the low side, your gauges should read about the same pressure on there, 70 psi, if it's 70 degrees outside. If it's 75 degrees outside, your gauge on the high side should read 75, and the gauge on the low side should read 75. But if it's low in refrigerant, remember I said it correlates with the pressure and the temperature of the outside air. If it's 75 degrees outside and your gauge set reads 40 and 40, that means you have low refrigerant.
Exactly. So static pressure. Once that thing clicks on, they'll start to go to the normal high and low side.
Right.
One more, Josh. One more. Here's one. So I hook up the gauges once again. And the low side we said was the pulling side from the actual orifice tube all the way to the compressor. It's high. So that tells me that no suction's going on. It's really not being able to pull the refrigerant back around that side of the system. And then from the compressor to the orifice tube is low as well. So, or excuse me, it's low. It's actually low. The high side's low, and the low side is high.
Yeah.
And Anakanapuna, Pepsi. Here we go. So the low side is high, and the high side is low. How in the world? That's really only one thing that could make that happen.
Yeah, a weak compressor. I mean, if you think about it, it's static pressure, no compressor operation whatsoever. If it's 70 degrees outside, you should see 70 and 70. If that thing, when it cuts on, that low side is going to drop from 70 down to 32, 35. But if it's weak, if I have a weak compressor and it's at the 45 range, that means it's not pulling down. If I'm not able to pull that refrigerant pressure down, then like you said, I'm not able to compress it and pump it up on the high side.
So on the low side, it's not pulling, and the high side, it's not pushing. Yeah,
right.
It's not compressing. So the high side is low, and the low side is high.
Makes sense.
It could make sense to you, yeah. Exactly. Too cool. All right, well, those are just a couple of things they can do and check some of your AC systems. You can take it to professional, look up a set of gauges and go through it and make sure. I know AC expenses can be very expensive. Repairs can be very expensive, that's for sure, when you get to a shop and you start looking at that stuff. But, hey, those tips should help you out.
Definitely so.
All right, so you know what? We're going to wrap this thing up. I hope you got something out of the AC system. Where are you going to get these podcasts? Everywhere, man, nationally known. We got our creative genius, E-Dub, behind the cameras there. He puts this all together, so thanks to him. Thanks to Chipola College. Thanks for the platform. Make sure you download it. Check the like box. Put the comments down there. We do read them. We may put your